All right. Welcome back once again. This is Amuni Israel. The Left Project, Soulonomics 101. I got a brief update. Like I said, if you guys want to contact me concerning reading or doing anything, you can definitely send me an email here or on social media. I have a little thing going on with my info at Amuni Israel email. So if you're sending anything there, I wouldn't be getting it at this particular time until that's straightened out. And so, yeah. And if you would like to read and you're interested in the Left Project, which by the way, now we're almost 7.5 months strong. The 14th of July, starting the 1st of January. Feel free to hit me up so that we can hear your voice reading. So I didn't come on yesterday because yesterday was wild. I had intentions on coming on yesterday, but yesterday was wild. I'll leave that for another day, right? I'm going to jump in. Okay, we're going to read 2 and 3 because it's not that long. We are reading currently The Other Side of Slavery. I introduced the thought as I'm going through this collectively with everybody. I'm putting together my other studies that I have studied as it relates to trauma and still studying as it relates to soul improvement, soul growth and development. I do have a course coming soon, Soulonomics 101, as well as the book is all finished. I'm just working on the launch of it. And all of what I do is really looking at, some people just concentrate on history for history's sake. I'm looking at history as it relates to our experience and others' experience, as well as that core, what is driving it at its core. You know, when we see a covetousness or covetousness at the core, hatred at the core, envy at the core, you know, these are the things that we see repeated through history. This is what drives human behavior. And so, you know, sometimes we get caught up in our emotions. And by the way, I just wanted to say, big up to everybody who is starting to subscribe. We have a new subscribers to the channel. Definitely big up yourself. As well as those who sometimes when I do news stories like this last one, I would just like to go on record by saying I do not advocate, you know, keyboard gangstering. You understand what I'm saying? I know there's a lot of people who is upset about the material, but this is why we need to work through what it is we're seeing. I'm not saying for us to just not express ourselves, but let's use wisdom as we express ourselves in this forum. Let me just say this, and in these mediums. So definitely as we go forward and we hear things that definitely are upsetting, we just have to be mindful of how we're expressing ourselves in certain forms. So once again, I haven't started as yet. I'm gonna share my screen. I want to thank everybody who's just joined us. Let me see here how I can share my screen so that you can see what I'm seeing and we can get with the get on. Let's see here. See what's going on with Mr. Blackford. As we said last week, you know, oftentimes during slavery, the perspective is different. And I'll keep saying that as I'm building on my domestic violence equivalent theory of slavery being looked at through this lens of domestic violence. And so as we're reading, this is a journal for those who haven't heard the first episode. This was a journal that was found at the Ferry Plantation, and the author is John Blackford. Him and his family owned a large amount of land. We just went through all the things that were happening in that city and how they're developing this actual. So this is business records we're about to look at, and we're going to see how for the European, the quote black man or black woman or child was just a ken, and they would say it. They were like a wheelbarrow or a hoe or a literal hoe, by the way, or a rake or a shovel, something that is used to get the job done. That's hence chattel slavery. You're not something that or someone that I need to really pay particularly close attention to. On the flip side of that, in this domestic violence narrative, you have the slave or the enslaved individuals and their family, where the master has become, you know, sense their whole world, because they're totally dependent upon him for food, clothing, and shelter. In some spaces, master made you call them Lord or master, which means in a you know, religious context, they put themselves as your God. And so when we have this conversation, sometimes people can't understand when they're looking at different parts of it, because the perspective is totally different. People say, why can't black people stop talking about slavery? You know, and white people say, just get over it. And that's usually the verbiage of the abuser. They want to get beyond it, because guess what? For an abuser, once you're no longer beneficial to me, you become a liability. And before and during slavery, you were an asset as it regarded them getting their job done and being more prosperous. And now that I cannot use you any longer, and this goes for any abusive relationship, narcissism, codependency, whatever it is, in any abusive relationship, once you are no longer suitable for exploitation, now you are demeaned in order to control you, so that yeah, basically that you can be controlled. So again, if you look at these two narratives, you'll see a lot of correlating information as well as it relates to trauma. That's another thing I find interesting. Hold on one second. I know I'm sharing my screen. 1 second, and I'm gonna start reading right now. Let me just make sure here that I can see and hear everybody. All right. Alrighty then. So let's go, shall we? And I want to thank everybody for joining us. A friend of mine, who I know for quite some time now, she sent me today, what's his name? Roland Martin, I believe his name is, where he went on the Wendy Williams show because Wendy Williams said some incorrect information as it related to the history of historically black colleges. And he went off on his show and he went on her show. And so a friend of mine said, oh, now I see why, I basically see the value of why you're pushing so much for this information, why you're pushing so much for us to read and know our history, because she's sitting in a position where she should know, and the reality is she didn't. But one thing I could respect about what she said was that she had to humble herself and apologize for speaking out of turn, speaking in ignorance, and she allowed him to come on her platform to share it with her listening audience. And this is the kind of stuff we need, where it is that if we don't know, it's cool to say we don't know, and we can do what we're doing right now, which is be willing to learn together. So without further ado, because I know it's late over here, I don't know about where you are, we're up to the intro part 2, the Blackford family. So John Blackford, 1618, they're missing a number on his date here. No, since November 1839, was a wealthy and prosperous businessman. In addition to his plantation and Ferry, he owned stock in Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. The Baltimore Insurance Company, and by the way, they used to insure slaves in some spaces. They would insure the slaves. So if you die, there's a level of insurance. And I did know, I read it as it related to coming over on the ships, and that they would insure per head. So everybody was involved in this thing. Sorry, the Boonesboro Turnpike Company and other unidentified business ventures. Furthermore, he lent considerable sums of money at interest. He was a public spirited leader in in his community. He served in the War of 1812 and commanded a company that, because of his actions at the disastrous Battle of Bladensburg, was dubbed the Bladensburg Racers. That's something to look up in history. Despite the poor showing of his troops captain, Blackford's reputation did not suffer. Let me make this a little bigger here. There's a glare off of this thing. It says it did not suffer. He at least was later promoted to a colonelcy in the volunteers. He served for many years as a justice of the peace, was supervisor of the public roads in his district, was active in organizing and building the Boonesboro Turnpike, was a delegate in several county conventions held to encourage the building of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. So for those who are in these areas of Baltimore, Virginia, this Blackford guy, I believe he would have a lot of history around where you are. And again, this plantation still stands. Some of the places that you may frequent, he has something to do with it. And Turnpike was a delegate to several council conventions held to encourage the building of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. And when it was organized in 1828, invested in its stock. In 1830, he was appointed to a committee of Boonesboro citizens to try to get the Baltimore Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church to locate its proposed college in that town. He never sought public office, but presided over a county Democratic Republican convention in 1828. He became an ardent Whig, and on occasion bitterly condemned the Democratic majority in the country for what he termed questionable action, end quote, in the conduct of local elections. Blackford was a communicant of the Episcopal Church, but not a regular attendant upon its services. He contributed to its support and to the German Reformed Presbyterian and Methodist churches. He gave handsome sums towards the building of the new church edifices of both Episcopal, that word always cracked me up, man, Episcopal, sorry, and German Reformed congregations, but he refused to contribute to the Maryland Bible Society. Again, as a researcher, like that was like a whole lot of information as it relates to validating. So one second. As it relates to validating all that we're seeing here. He says, Mrs. Blackford family, Blackford married in the Node family, which had migrated into Western Maryland and Virginia with the earliest German settlers from Pennsylvania. His wife was an invalid for some years and was confined to her bed for most of the period by the Ferry Hill Plantation Journal. Blackford was deeply devoted to her, gave her all possible medical attention, sent her to the Belinda Springs, 2 miles southeast of Sharpsburg, to take advantage of its medicinal water, and himself took her for a week stay at the more famous Chandel Springs near Charleston, Virginia. But all to no avail. Miss Blackford died on October the 7th, 1838. Miss Blackford bore her husband 5 children, 3 sons and 2 daughters. Franklin, the eldest son, was married and had 1 child. He and his wife Elizabeth lived in one of the dwelling houses on his father's plantation. He engaged in various enterprises, among them running a tavern, breeding horses, and operating a line of packet boats on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. He sometimes assisted his father in managing Ferry Hill, but did not seem to have his father's full confidence. Jeanette Y. Blackford's eldest daughter married Dr. Otho Josiah Smith of Boonesboro. He was a graduate of the University of Maryland and had studied medicine under Dr. Charles McGill of Hagerstown. Blackford's second son, Henry V.S., or Henry V, I guess, was a student at the Merchantsburg, Pennsylvania Academy in 1837 to 1839. Helena, the youngest daughter, was unmarried and lived with her parents. William Moore, the youngest child, was just beginning his schooling in 1838 at Francis Jury School in Boonesboro. So they're going to school, they're going to colleges, they're getting married. See, they're just living their whole life, owning a whole lot of things, having a whole lot of enterprises, had his hand in a little bit of everything. 3 of Blackford's wives' relatives lived on Ferry Hill Plantation. Catherine Node, a sister, never married, and John Blackford, in his will, provided for her an annuity for life. Charles Node, a brother, rented the Bedford place from Blackford and cultivated on shares. Joseph Node, a nephew, rented the Shepherd Farm as a share tenant. He sometimes assisted Blackford with the plantation, boarded some of his hired hands, and permitted his slaves to work in the fields with Blackford's slaves. In fact, it seems that slaves belonging to John Blackford, Franklin Blackford, Miss Otho J. Smith, Charles Node, and Joseph Node worked interchangeably for their respective masters. The Nodes, a large clan, were frequent visitors of the Ferry Hill place. Remember when we read earlier on, he says he kept notes of who visited, who came, who went, like he was an informant. So we're up to 3. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to let me know. We're up to now. How late am I? Denary, we just started. We're still in the introduction. I just started reading like 5 minutes. I just finished going through 2. This is still the introduction. We didn't even get in his journal yet. They're just giving the backdrop of this dude was basically wealthy. He was into a little bit of everything. And his farm housed not only him, but his extended family. And again, as you see, they're talking about slaves intermittently. They haven't so far as told us the lives of the quote slaves. It was more about the life of Blackford. So we're going to continue. Blackford, like most Southern planters, was a busy and hardworking man. Listen to I'm sorry, whoever's working this introduction is funny, but let me continue. He did not, of course, do manual labor, but he chose to manage his plantation and supervise his varied business interests without the help of an overseer. The only manual labor he reported during 1838 was to place the crank and handle of a grindstone broken by one of his hired laborers. And it took him the entire day to perform this minor task. The only time he mentioned an overseer in his journal for 1838 was when an overseer from a neighboring plantation sought a job with Blackford because his current employer had decided to rent rather than cultivate his plantation. Much of Blackford's time was spent in his office where he kept the plantation journal, published herewith, a financial record of the ferry, records of his activity as a justice of the peace, and other business transactions. As noted above, Blackford rented farms to his son, because remember, we read that he had over 800 acres. So it says he rented farms to his son and two of his wife's relatives. This relieved him of close supervision over the cultivation of these lands. How profitable his rental lands were, the records do not show. Joseph Noel paid him 380 bushels of corn, 138 and three-fourths bushels of wheat, and 85 and one-half bushel of rye for the Shepherd farm in 1837. So imagine what the yield is if he paid him that just to rent the farm. In addition, Blackford received unsuspected quantities of forage, including shucks and fodder from the corn, straw from wheat and rye, and clover and timothy hay. Blackford appointed two of his slaves as, quote, foremen of the ferry, end quote. They did the work themselves, called on other slaves to assist, and even hired free labor, both white and black, to assist in rush periods. Because remember, we read that at least 1/3 of the town that they're in, I think it was like 1,500 thereabout, were, quote, black free slave, not free slave, black free. So, and 2,500 were enslaved. It says they kept the receipts from the ferry and were permitted to spend money therefrom for supplies as the need arose. They generally reported the receipts daily, but sometimes they did not report for several days. Obviously, Blackford denoted little of his time to the management of the ferry. All right. So we're reading about his business affairs. It says here, the slaves and hired laborers who did the general plantation work carried on with a minimum of direct supervision. Again, this is just the culture of his farm. Occasionally, Blackford might ride in the fields, the range, or the woods to give general directions or to specify exactly what work was to be done. For instance, I rode out, this is they quoting him, I rode out and marked off the land I wish cleared. Blackford seemed to have found the system satisfactory. Certainly, he recorded few complaints about the work done. Blackford himself looked after his rental property, including the quote-unquote cottage and the houses in Shepherdstown, and he gave considerable time and attention to lending money and supervising his investments. These affairs caused him considerable difficulty, and he employed Joseph I. Merrick, a prominent lawyer of Haggerston and Baltimore, to assist him in these matters. The most important money crop grown at Ferry Hill was wheat. Blackford experimented with various types, particularly blue stem and white, in an effort to increase the yield. Other crops were corn, rye, oats, buckwheat, hay, including timothy and red and white clover. They told us that already, but we'll continue. Broom, corn, potatoes, apples, pumpkins, turnips, hemp, and flax. Blackford harvested his own seed and sold seed to the neighboring farmers and planters. He had his grain milled at Moomas, Stoobs, and Glassford's mills located on Antietam Creek, and shipped flour and meal to Baltimore for sale. Apples, vinegar, cider, apple butter, and potatoes were sold in the local markets. How long ago this was? This wasn't that long ago, but let's continue. Second in economic importance to general field crops at Ferry Hill was timber. The forest supplied wood for fuel in homes, post rails, and paling for fences, and plank, scantling and shingles to keep the barns, stables, storage houses, and dwelling houses in repair. I just wanted to say here, oftentimes when you look at the slave master to slave narrative, oftentimes they talk about the mentality of, quote, black people, not as a whole, but certain demographics. All of this portion of him running his enterprise, of which enslaved individuals were a part of, many people, because there were other narratives that we read, slaves oftentimes, especially the field ones, couldn't come within any 20 feet of the big house. So all of what he's doing, all of the bookkeeping, because it's actually a business, oftentimes our ancestors would not have been privy to this side of what slavery was, which is again, it's like he's running a corporation. It's bookkeeping. It's making sure that all of these things are in place in order for it to run. And I just think that's interesting, because when we talk about liberation or freedom or economy, we tend to be like, well, all we need is this, and then this happens. And the reality is, no, once you do this, a lot of work needs to happen in order for it to be sustainable and to be kept up. In this case, they, instead of hiring people, they chose to use people who were stolen. But that doesn't take away from the business aspect of things need to be in order for a town, a city, a country, wherever it is that you're imagining that you're going to be in charge of. You need all of these things in place. And that's just my takeaway from reading all of this. For those who've just joined us, continue to stay with us, because we're looking at another side of this conversation as it relates to slavery. I'm for all sides, all sides. It says here, I mean, in respect to getting understanding, not for all sides, like what they was doing. Second in economic importance to the general field crops at Ferry Hill was timber. The forest supplied wood for fuel. Okay, I read that. My bad. Storage houses and dwelling houses in repair. Blackford employed a large number of hired workers for work in the woods during the fall and winter months. He sold large quantities of wood for fuel to the inhabitants of Shepherdstown, Sharpsburg, and Boonesboro. The wood sold for $2.50 per cord. And Blackford sold as many as 100 cords per year to a single customer in Shepherdstown. So 100 times 250 in 30s, 1820s. So, and this is just for one enterprise of him cutting down some wood on. So understand, this dude is making money. It says some households sent their own labor to cut and haul their wood. In addition to wood for fuel, Blackford sold posts, planks, scantlings, and shingles in considerable quantities. In some instances, he sold logs to the mill. He supplied various mills and factories with their particular needs. For instance, he sold Antietam iron work gum, oak, hickory suitable for making helves for the huge hammers used in its plant. I'm wondering if that's supposed to be shelves, because sometimes they got some typos. And he sold timber to the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Company for fuel and repairs. The ferry across the Potomac River was an important adjunct to the plantation. Blackford bought a 1/2 interest in the ferry from Henry Thomas Van Swearingen in 1816 for $900. He later bought the remaining half from Mrs. Swearingen for an undisclosed sum. Blackford rarely failed to close the daily entry in his journal without some comment on the ferry business. Usually, it was a laconic note running from very poor through poor, tolerable, middling, good to very good. The state franchise laid down general regulations for ferriage, but Blackford could fix specific charges. Thus, the foreman charged a sheep herder $4 for ferrying a herd of 500 sheep across the river, but charged the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Company $133.16 for ferrying 2 loads of gun stocks destined for Harper's Ferry. Okay, and remember, it sounds like a little bit of money today, but in this space and time, is not that small. The foreman had some difficulty in agreeing upon the charges for a circus company. The owner appealed to Blackford, and only after considerable haggling, quote unquote, did he pay the charges. The ferry was a profitable investment. In 1837, he brought Blackford $697 above the cost of operation, and it continued to yield a profit for Blackford's son, Franklin, to whom it descended in 1839, until he sold it to a company which built a bridge across the river, which in turn abandoned the ferry in 1850. And this is all before the actual Civil War, like 1850, like 10 years off from when the Civil War is actually gonna, start popping. So he's like, and he dies before it actually gets to that point. Blackford took great pride in livestock breeding of all sorts. He raised enough hogs to supply Ferry Hill with an ample pork, sausage, ham, and surplus for sale. He cured his own meats, and in 1838 bought a machine for making and stuffing sausage, and liver pudding, which he found greatly facilitated the process. So successful was the machine that neighboring planters made use of it. Blackford raised sheep for food and wool, Among others, he raised Saxons and Merinos. The wool was processed on the plantation and made into coarse cloth, which the seamstress made into garments for the workforce. That had to be itchy. Wool is really itchy. Blackford sent yarn to Conroe woolen mills in Frederick and had it made into fine grade carpets. Blackford raised cattle to supply the plantation with milk, butter, beef, and work oxen. He kept a blooded bull to maintain the quality of his herd. Blackford kept brood mares and stallions and raised horses to be used on the planet. Like he's reading us his resume right about now. Like really. Occasionally he bred his mares to stallions widely known throughout the region. Blackford practiced the arts of a veterinarian, not always successful, and he raised bees, chickens, turkeys, and peafowl. Feathers from the latter were marketed in Washington, D.C. Again, doesn't sound like, okay, we finally get to labor force. I'll have to keep reading because, we haven't seen what's going on yet. Let's hear how they reference the labor force, quote unquote. Blackford might be called a progressive farmer. He made extensive use of natural manures and purchased agricultural lime, which he applied to his grain and hay crops. Although he continued to use outmoded tools and time-worn methods of cultivation, he adopted and used new and improved farm implements and machinery, including harrows and rollers. Some of his grain was cut with 6 skeets and hand cradles, but in 1838, if I said that word wrong, my apologies. He rented a harvesting machine, probably a McCormick reaper. Isn't that the name of the seasoning, McCormick? I'm sorry, for cutting his wheat. Some grain was threshed by wooden flails or by treading. But in 1838, Blackford used a threshing machine driven by horses, and he owned a windmill, or as he called it, a revolving machine, end quote, powered by 9 horses. He used blooded cattle. I don't know what that means, blooded cattle. Horses, hogs, sheep for improving his livestock. It is not known that Blackford took any prizes at the local county agricultural society fair, but he was certainly aware of the extensive prize lists published in local newspaper, which included horses, cattle, sheep, hogs, poultry, wheat, corn, rye, oat, clover, potatoes, domestic linseed, and carpets, apple cider, and vinegar, all of which were produced at Ferry Hill. So let's read a little bit about who's been missing in this whole long conversation about what's going on at his farm. Chapter 4, or part 4 of the introduction, the labor force. The Ferry Hill labor force consisted of 25 slaves and a large number of hired workers. Among the slaves were 7 young children. 2 of the adults regularly attended the ferry, an unknown number were house servants. The remainder worked at whatever was to be done on the plantation, cutting firewood and saw timber, caring for livestock, planting, cultivating and harvesting the grain, hay, and apple crops. And such irregular, the baby's running away with my water, 1 second. And such irregular jobs as filling the 2 ice houses and rebuilding the cistern and waterworks from Ferry Hill Place. During the year, 3 births were recorded, 2 of which were stillborn. And that's another thing that we have been reading through these narratives. There was a push for, especially when it became illegal, the slave trade, for inbreeding and to be bred, but there was a large number of children through the work of their mothers during gestation that are stillborn or die shortly after death. Die shortly after birth. So it says 3 births and 2 were stillborn. The slaves were generally satisfactory workers. Ned and Jupe, who were assigned as foremen of the ferry, were never criticized in regard to their work. So now we know their names, who went to the ferry. Occasionally, Blackford would complain that some of the field hands or woodcutters were piddling at the job, but only 1 severe criticism was recorded of any of the slave workers. Once 3 slaves and an equal number of hired laborers, including 1 German, were hauling wheat from the fields and storing it in the barns. Blackford found their work wanting and recorded of their activities, quote, bad plan and poorly managed. Let me say that again. Quote, bad plan and poorly managed Negro dictation, end quote. The slaves were generally trusted and rarely closely supervised. As already noted, Ned and Jupe were given full command of the ferry. They were permitted to hire extra labor at rush periods and to spend money from the ferriage receipts without specific authorization. So this is like you get to be the manager. They give you the corner office. You get to put on their tag. I'll let you know, and you're like, yeah, I've arrived. That kind of thing. I trust you. You know, that kind of thing. Other slaves were sent to Sharperstown. Sorry, I'm bugging out. It's late, everybody. Shepherdstown, Sharpsboro, or even Boonesboro with cash with which to purchase groceries, tobacco, clothing, and various other commodities. In fact, Blackford once sent one of his slaves to town to purchase trimming for a fancy vest he had a tailor cut for himself. They were permitted to drive horses and carriages to the neighboring towns, and in no instant was this trust violated. So again, they're trying to say, oh, he had good slaves, quote unquote. And of course, you know, they had to run with their slave passes. It says the slaves were well clothed and well fed. Blackford bought clothing for his slaves individually and when needed, and did not distribute it to them at stated periods in the fall and spring as most planters did. And we read about that with Lewis Hughes. We read about that with Charles Ball. We read about that in so many other narratives that we've read that on certain. So they're basically trying to say he wasn't the normal planter because they would get clothes only at set period of time. And if it wore out, that it just wore out. So they're trying to say, you know, they had fringe benefits for working for Blackfoot. You know, it says, in fact, he often let the slave purchase his own clothing. The following entries taken from the journal are typical. Gave Ned $1.50 to pay for a blanket which he bought of Lane and Webb. Gave Murph a new coat, good Lindsay. Gave Will $12.5 to buy him some tobacco. Blackford was most solicitous about the health and well-being of his slaves. Little Caroline fell while playing in the barnyard, and Dr. Richard Parent was called to treat her bruises. Little George fell ill, and Blackford immediately sent for Dr. Parent to attend him. When Hannah, Will's wife, was delivered of a female child, Miss Israel, that's interesting, Fry, a midwife, attended her. Daphne, who was pregnant, was taken ill, and Dr. Parent and Miss Fry were both called. She had a miscarriage and was hospitalized for 11 days. So the same thing I said, miscarriages, stillborns, this was oftentimes common practice due to the labor. But they, like, again, this is very interesting because when then you come on to say, oh, people will say their master wasn't that mad. And after slavery, they really didn't want to leave. It depends on the conditions. There was one ex-slave who said there were varying degrees to slavery. And it doesn't condone what happened, but this is for us to get a broader view that when we say slavery, we can't say everybody was getting beat or everybody was getting starved because that's not historically accurate. As much as we want to believe that everybody had a roots experience or everybody had an underground experience, that's not necessarily true. That doesn't make the institution of slavery incorrect. It just means that we have to kind of grow in our understanding of what really happened. Blackford showered his slaves with special favors. In addition to furnishing them with tobacco, really, he brought and distributed whiskey to the workers. That's the special. You see, you know, the alcohol in the community is not your fault. You know, I saw a video. Why you want to blame? I'm sorry, I digress for a little bit. Why you want to blame the European for everything? Look what he gave his slaves. He didn't mistreat them. But hey, I know you still a slave, so here, smoke on this Lucy and drink some whiskey. That's a favor. They call it special favors. This is what the person who wrote this introduction call it. So when you see this kind of behavior as a coping mechanism still in the community, people say, oh, don't blame the white man. But right here, Blackford is the one who introduced this to his, quote, slaves. But I thought that was interesting. Let me continue. He permitted them to visit the family and slaves of his daughters. Miss Otho J. Smith in Boonesboro, they drove a cart and carried chickens, eggs, butter, and other such commodities to them. Occasionally, they were given stagecoach fare to make the trip of some 11 miles to Boonesboro. Despite such treatment, Blackford Oh, you could guess. Sorry. Let me read this real slow, right? Despite such treatment, Blackford slaves were not a contented lot. Caroline, Daphne, Will, and Isaiah were all reported as runaways more than once. Daphne on one occasion got to Sharpsburg, where she spent the night before Henry, who went in pursuit, end quote, overtook her. Isaiah, a house servant who was reported, quote, absent without permission, end quote, went to Boonesboro. Were they merely taking advantage of their liberties? Were they stimulated in their efforts by numerous free slaves who resided in the neighborhood? Or did they seek freedom as a natural right? They're asking the question. Some of Blackford's slaves were an ill-behaved lot. I'm sorry. They frequently indulged in excess use of liquor. Ned, a foreman of the Ferry, was reported by Helen Blackford to be quite much intoxicated at high noon. Yeah, he's trying to numb himself from his reality. Again, he, quote, came up from the ferry after dark, quite stupid with liquor, end quote. The following entries in the journal are typical. Murph and Julius both drank, but he's the one who was giving it to them as favors. If you have anything to say, feel free to put it in the box, because sometimes I start commenting to myself here. It says Murph drank as usual. Murph down at the ferry pretty drunk. So were they making this liquor, Mr. Blackford, or were you supplying it for them? Blackford, who reported that he once got, quote, very high on champagne when on a business trip to Hangstown, did not punish his slaves for drunkenness. In fact, he seemed to condone the practice, same thing I just said, and once excused them for being a little, quote, slow and stiff, end quote, at the harvesting of wheat because, quote, they had no bitters. The whiskey, which they all love dearly, has given out. So this thought of tobacco and whiskey going to the corner store, it's from this point, as an escape from the reality. So sometimes we like, what's the value of reading some of this stuff? We get to understand what's really happening. But Blackford did not fail to administer punishment when he felt it was deserved. Careless or deliberate destruction of property he would not tolerate. Enoch, quote, suffered the gray mare to run off and broke off shafts off the cart, end quote. And Blackford, quote, corrected him by giving him a few lashes, end quote. Isaiah sat the people's victuals down and the hogs destroyed it, end quote. And Blackford, quote, whipped him, end quote. Again, Blackford, quote, punished Isaiah pretty severely for his misconduct, end quote. Among other offenses recorded, several of which went unpunished, were, quote, use of profane language, end quote, quote, bad conduct, eavesdropping, and attempt to break into Blankley's house, end quote. Quote, Caroline behaved bad in the kitchen, and Ned beat Little John, end quote. Jupe and Caroline behaved bad, and Ned confessed to the destruction of 2 peacocks. 2 of young slaves, quote, Little Caroline and Little George, were accused of pilfering money from members of the Blackford family, but neither charge was proven. So not only were they enslaving you when you were behaving badly, well, in particular, Mr. Blackford, he felt it necessary to get your public record. Don't you notice that anytime something happens? See, it's not the fact that you are in this condition, you're behaving badly in this condition. And so just to make you look or cast whatever doubt on your name, I'm going to show you a record of, see, this is why you deserve whatever it is that you deserve. Very interesting. Let me see if anybody has any questions. Hold on, let me release my screen so that doesn't keep jumping back and forth. This is getting interesting here. Let's see. Any questions? No questions? All right. No questions. I'm going to keep reading. Let's finish this one up. He says here, judging from the record, Blackford was a kindly, and this dude is crazy. Judging from the record, Blackford was a kindly, even indulgent master. His slaves were well-fed, well-clothed, worked almost entirely without supervision, were given all sorts of special privileges, were given the same sort of medical care as the members of their master's family, and were not severely punished. Blackford hired out 2 of his slaves to clothe personal friends, and in each case, the contract called for, quote, good and sufficient clothing and provisions, end quote. Finally, in his will, Blackford declared, quote, "It is my will and desire that care shall be taken to prevent any of my slaves being sold out of the state or to slave traders or their agents, unless for grave faults, or to any but humane and good masters." Blackford employed a large number of hired laborers for seasonal farm work, for cutting wood and timber, and for special jobs such as filling the ice houses and repairing work on barns and houses. Some few were hired for the year. The hired laborers included native whites. Native whites? I'm sorry, they got. I'm sorry. That one. Native whites, foreigners, whom Blackford called Germans, Dutch, Scotch, Irish, Italian, free Negroes, slaves belonging to his neighbors, and Indians. So this dude is an equal opportunity employer. Most of these were unskilled workers, but Blackford occasionally hired skilled carpenters and brick masons. The latter was employed to remodel his own house and to rebuild a cistern and waterworks. It is impossible to say just how many workers Blackford employed, but a count for 2 months in 1838 discloses 3 slaves, 4 free Negroes, 3 Indians, 2 Dutchmen, 6 Germans, 1 Irishman, 1 Italian, and 21 local whites. If you notice, there's a book out that's called The Invention of White People. At this time, you notice that, again, that's why I always say quote unquote black, quote unquote white. At this time in 1838, he is still classifying people by Indian, Dutch, German, Irish, Italian, and then local whites. Like that just popped in there. Like, what are they? So if they're local whites, who are the rest of these people? That's just a food for thought as we continue. Nor is there sufficient evidence to generalize about wages or the quality of work done. One white man was paid $1 per day. A white woman, 62.5 cents. A Negro girl, 87.5 cents in wheat harvesting. An old man who did what Blackford called piddling work was given his keep, a little tobacco, and an occasional sum of money for making fence palings. An old, quote, Negro was hired to make brooms and broom corn grown on the plantations at 6 and 1/4 cents each. One free Negro cut 18.5 cords of wood, splitting 550 fence rails, and sawed blocks for shingles and logs for lumber, but his wages were not recorded. One white laborer split 2,640 shingles by hand. A carpenter pulled off the old roof of the barn and smokehouse on Shepherd Farm and nailed on 6,800 shingles on the house in Shepherdstown. The brick mason who rebuilt the cistern and waterworks at Ferry Place was engaged in the task for more than a month. And we go down here. We're almost finished. The hired laborers generally proved satisfactory workers, but they occasionally fell under condemnation. For instance, 2 free Negro woodcutters were denied the use of Blackford's grindstone because, quote, they had carelessly broken the handle off the crank, end quote. Isaac Widows, a white woodcutter, also, quote, broke the crank of my grindstone. I conclude he is very trifling, end quote. Martin Shellman, another white man and a trifling fellow, was discharged but continued on the place and ate in the kitchen with the Negroes, end quote. Both these men had been employed for the year and both were re-employed after having been discharged. Blackford's chief grievance against his hired laborers was the excessive use of whiskey. He himself contributed to the habit by serving them liquor and by furnishing them money to purchase it for themselves. On one occasion, Nicholas and Martin came to work, but both are for a spray. Blackford gave Nicholas $2.75 and Martin $1, which will keep them drunk for some time. This is what the man wrote, end quote. After Shellman, quote, went on a spray for more than a week, end quote, which he had spent in Sharpsburg, and where he had taken one of Blackford's sheep's dogs. Blackford called him on August 26 and gave him a lecture on whiskey drinking. Quote, he said he would quit and drink no more, end quote. On September 4th, Blackford wrote, Shellman making shingles sober and steady. So they came to work, turned up. September 20th, Shellman still perfectly sober. Blackford thought he had worked a cure, but alas, on September 30th, Shellman came in the evening, has been drunk in Sharpsburg all last night, end quote. A few days later, a stranger called and asked for a job, but Blackford decided, quote, he looked like a drinker, therefore I will not employ him, end quote. It might be noted that Blackford treated his hired laborers as individuals, be they black or white, slave or free, and judged each on his own merits. Like, is this one of his foreparents, like one of his ancestors writing this? Because they are like really trying to paint him in a light like he was the best thing since sliced bread. Lastly, it says, one example will suffice. Isaac Widows, a white man employed for the year, quote, called wants, meats, bread, and money, gave him none. Negro George came, gave him $1 to purchase a hat. And so that we're going to stop at 5 in this introduction. This introduction is hilarious. But we're seeing some of the behaviors that often is getting demonized today that was a part of the culture then. And this particular slave owner is actually, like they say, encouraging it and forcing it. And it was amongst the quote, both black and white. And I don't know who the white people, so-called white people, if he named all of the other nationalities. That is very interesting. But once again, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. It's 10:42. I hope you're enjoying this reading here, John Blackford. We're reading about the other side of quote, slavery as it related to the business dealings and their day-to-day and what they faced, and why it is that even in today's time, maybe they cannot relate to you, because the reality is they did not experience slavery the same as our foreparents did. So with that, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. If you have any questions or comments, or if you would like to read for upcoming conversations, just put a link under this video. Let me know. I'll give you the link and you can come in and have the conversation. So until next time. Wow, tomorrow's Friday. I'll try to come on tomorrow before it gets late, because after that I rest. And so I'll see if I could come on tomorrow. If I don't, then I'll come on Saturday in the night after the sun goes down. So with that said, thank everybody for tuning in. This is Soulonomics 101. Definitely feel free to peruse the links, check out the books that we have so far on Amazon, Create Space, and support the movement. We do have t-shirts. They're coming back soon. So definitely continue to look out for the Lev Project t-shirts and promote literacy in our community. We definitely need it. So with that, one.